$47. That was all she had left. Loretta Weaver counted the bills twice because the first time her hands were shaking too badly to keep the ones separate from the fives. She spread them flat on the Formica counter and smoothed each crumpled edge with the pad of her thumb, a gesture that was partly habit and partly the need to do something with her hands that did not involve pressing them over her eyes and giving in to the kind of crying that had no bottom to it. $47. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of waking before dawn to brew coffee and scramble eggs and smile at people she would never see again. 15 years of Calvin's dream made concrete in cracked red vinyl and buzzing fluorescent lights in a neon sign outside that flickered in the cold like a heart that could not quite decide whether to keep beating. Outside, Highway 70 was disappearing. The snow had been falling since noon, soft at first, the kind that made the mountains look like a painting someone was still working on. By evening, it had turned serious. By 8 o'clock, it had become something else entirely, like a wall of white that moved with the purposeful fury of a thing that had made up its mind. The heating system wheezed and clicked in the walls, fighting a battle it had been losing since October. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with the particular desperation of machinery that understood it was running on borrowed time. The dining room was empty. The dining room had been mostly empty for 6 months since the construction detour had rerouted traffic 12 miles north, and the travelers who used to stop at Crossroads Diner had found other places to eat, other warmth to borrow. The red vinyl booths along the windows held only the memory of customers mapped in faded impressions and coffee ring stains, and the occasional initials carved by someone who had wanted to leave a mark somewhere, who had needed proof that they had passed through. The clock above the register read 8:15. Loretta's eyes drifted the way they always did at this hour to booth number 4. Calvin's booth, 2 years dead from the cancer that had moved through him like a slow fire. And she could still see him there, clear as morning, his big, gentle frame taking up the whole bench, his dark eyes full of that stubborn optimism that had driven her crazy and kept her alive in equal measure. They had bought this place with her grandmother's inheritance, and everything Calvin had saved from 12 years of long-haul trucking, 2 people with more dreams than sense, and a belief that hard work and kindness could build something that mattered. "We are going to make it work, baby." His voice in her memory so clear, it was almost a sound in the room. This place is going to be a light for travelers, a home away from home, every single time. The light above flickered, once, twice, held. Loretta pulled the foreclosure notice from beneath the register and read it again, though she had memorized every word 3 days ago when the process server had left it in her hand without meeting her eyes. First, Mountain Savings, outstanding balance including late fees and legal costs, $15,240. You have 7 days to remit payment in full or vacate the premises. 7 days. She might as well have owed $15 million. She had sold the wedding ring in January, Calvin's tools in March, the truck in August, the good one, the one he had kept so clean you could eat off the engine block. She had called the legal aid office and been told there was nothing to be done without proof of bad faith. She had walked into First Mountain Savings and sat across from Dennis Keller, the bank manager, a thin man with silver hair combed back tight against his skull and pale eyes that measured everything in terms of its liquidation value. He had listened to her with the patient expression of someone waiting for a dog to finish a trick. Then he had folded his manicured hands on his mahogany desk and explained that the bank had been more than patient. 3 months behind Mrs. Weaver, an extraordinary accommodation. My hands are tied. His hands had not looked tied. They had looked perfectly comfortable resting on that desk beside the Summit Ridge development brochure sitting in his outbox beneath the photograph showing Dennis Keller shaking hands with the county commissioner, the mayor, 2 state senators, and men in expensive suits, whose names Loretta did not know, but whose presence in those frames told her everything she needed to understand about how this was going to end. She had said nothing about what she noticed. She had gathered her purse and her dignity and walked out and driven home through the graying autumn rain to an empty diner and a stack of bills that did not care about dignity. She had gotten the notice 3 days ago and had spent every hour since running the same calculation, the same hopeless arithmetic that always produced the same answer. No savings left, no assets left to sell, no family to borrow from, no bank that would refinance a property already in default. The legal aid lawyer had been kind and apologetic and ultimately useless. There was nothing to be done, he said, without evidence of bad faith on the bank's part. And the fact that Dennis Keller had meetings with Summit Ridge developers on his calendar was not evidence. It was, he said carefully, just coincidence. She opened the register one more time. Still $47. The kitchen door swung open and Destiny Cross appeared, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her dark curly hair pulled back in a messy knot. She was 22 years old with the kind of face that switched between tough and tender, so fast it could give you whiplash, wide brown eyes above cheekbones that could cut glass, a mouth that smiled easy but meant it hard. She had come into this diner 3 years ago as a girl, with nothing, a runaway from Grand Junction, with bruises on her arms and a flinch built into every movement, and Loretta had fed her and hired her, and eventually given her the spare room above the kitchen, because that was what you did when someone walked through your door broken and hungry. It was what Calvin would have done. "Kitchen is shut down," Destiny said, tossing the towel over her shoulder. "Every dish washed, every surface wiped." 47, Loretta confirmed. Destiny leaned against the counter and studied the crumpled bills with the detached expression of someone who had learned early that money was a thing that happened to other people. She glanced at the foreclosure notice. 7 days. And Keller will not budge. Man has never budged on anything in his life except his hairline. Loretta pressed her palms flat against the counter, feeling the cool surface that Calvin had installed himself, carrying each piece of formica in from the truck on his broad shoulders while she held the measuring tape and told him he was cutting it crooked. He was not cutting it crooked. He never cut anything crooked in his life. "We could call the lawyer again," Destiny suggested, "the one from the legal aid office. Called him yesterday. He needs proof that the bank is acting in bad faith. Dennis Keller having meetings with developers on his calendar is not proof. It is just coincidence." Her voice carried the particular bitterness of someone who understood exactly how the world worked and resented it anyway. Destiny was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and placed her hand on top of Loretta's, her slim brown fingers covering the older woman's weathered knuckles. "Calvin would not want you to give up." "Calvin is not here," Loretta whispered. The wind screamed outside and the building shuddered, and the lights flickered 3 times before steadying. Through the window there was nothing to see but white. Loretta straightened her spine and walked to the light switch by the front door. She was reaching for it when the phone on the wall rang. The sound was so unexpected in the quiet room that she startled. She crossed to it and picked up the receiver. "Crossroads Diner." The voice on the other end was clipped and precise, the voice of a man accustomed to conducting business regardless of the hour. "Mrs. Weaver, Dennis Keller, I apologize for the late call." Her jaw tightened. "Mr. Keller, I wanted to let you know that the bank has received an offer from a developer. They are prepared to take possession immediately upon foreclosure. The process may move faster than 7 days." "Faster." The word hit her like a fist. "You said I had 7 days. If a buyer is already in place, the court may expedite." His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had practiced performing helplessness until it sounded sincere. "I strongly suggest you begin making arrangements to vacate." "This is my home," Loretta said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "This was my husband's dream." "I understand that, and I am sympathetic. But business is business, Mrs. Weaver. My hands are tied." "Your hands are always tied, Mr. Keller. I wonder who keeps tying them." A pause. When he spoke again, the veneer of professional courtesy had worn through to something harder beneath. "Mrs. Weaver, this property is going to be foreclosed. That is a certainty. The only question is whether you leave with dignity or whether you force the sheriff to remove you. I suggest you choose wisely." He hung up. Loretta stood holding the dead receiver, staring at the wall. 7 days that might now be 2 or 3. She set the phone down carefully, the way you set something down when everything inside you wants to throw it. And she stood very still for a long moment, with her hands flat on the counter and the $47 spread in front of her and the foreclosure notice beside it, and she did not cry because crying did not pay the mortgage. And it did not keep the lights on, and it was not what Calvin would have done. Destiny was watching her from across the counter. She had heard both sides of the call. She did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. Loretta's fingers were on the light switch when she heard it, a sound that did not belong to wind or snow, or the mechanical complaints of a dying building. A low, deep rumble that vibrated up through the floor and into her feet and up through her bones, slow and deliberate, like drums beating in formation, like thunder rolling across the earth in measured intervals. She pressed her face to the glass and squinted into the white wall of the storm, and for several seconds she saw nothing at all. Then the lights appeared, not the broad sweep of a snowplow or the high beams of a semi, a constellation of individual headlights, low and tight, moving in precise formation through conditions that should have made travel impossible. She counted as they emerged from the storm, like something materializing from smoke. 15, 18, more, each machine carrying a rider hunched against the wind leather and chrome, cutting through the snow with a determination that bordered on insanity. Motorcycles. Destiny appeared at her shoulder, dish towel still in her hand. Those are motorcycles. On a mountain highway, Loretta's voice was steady. In a blizzard, at 8:30 at night. The engines cut off one by one, each silence more ominous than the sound it replaced, until the parking lot went quiet except for the howl of the wind. Through the glass, Loretta could see the riders dismounting, dark shapes against the snow, moving with the slow, deliberate gait of men who had been riding for hours and whose bodies had gone stiff with cold and exhaustion. The lead rider was the first to approach the door. He was tall, 6'4" at least, with broad shoulders that strained the frozen leather of his jacket and a gray-streaked dark beard that had gone white with frost before the porch light began to melt it. He moved with a limp, not dramatic, but present, the kind that came from an old injury aggravated by cold and too many miles. Even through the glass, Loretta could see the patches on his jacket, the distinctive insignia, the winged skull, the words that made sensible people cross to the other side of the street. Hell's Angels. She counted 23 of them assembling in her parking lot, stamping their boots and shaking snow from their jackets, a small army of leather and muscle and reputation that had materialized from the storm like a vision from a world she had never inhabited. They were massive men, most of them the kind who had learned to occupy space as both comfort and warning. Tattoos crept up necks and across knuckles. Scars traced paths across weathered faces. Beards and deep-set eyes spoke of years on the road and a code that existed outside the law but was no less rigid for it. The lead rider reached the front door. He paused with his gloved hand on the handle, and through the glass, Loretta could see his face clearly for the first time. He was older than she had expected, 50 maybe, with lines carved deep around pale blue eyes that held the particular exhaustion of a man who had been fighting the world for decades and was not sure he was winning anymore. His jacket was frozen stiff ice clinging to the leather in patches that glittered under the porch light. The patch above his left breast pocket read President. Below the chapter name on his back, Thunder Ridge. He knocked. 3 gentle raps that managed to be both respectful and desperate. The knock of a man who understood that he was asking for something he had no right to demand. Loretta looked at the $47 on the counter. She looked at the foreclosure notice. She looked at the empty diner that Calvin had dreamed into existence, and she had kept alive on stubbornness and love, and the stubborn belief that it still mattered. Then she looked at the man standing in the storm. Calvin's voice in her memory so clear, it might have been standing right beside her. A light for travelers, baby. A home away from home, every single time. She walked to the door and turned the lock. The moment it opened, the storm came in like it had been waiting for an invitation. Snow swirled across the threshold. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single breath, and the man standing before her brought the full weight of a Colorado blizzard into the warm space Loretta had been trying to protect. He was covered head to toe in ice and frost, his leather jacket crackling as he moved his beard, a frozen sculpture that would have been almost comical under any other circumstances. Behind him, the others were already moving toward the door, a procession of frozen leather and chrome, and the kind of physical presence that made the diner feel suddenly impossibly small. "Ma'am," the leader's voice came out rough, scraped raw by cold and wind, and what sounded like decades of hard living. "I know this is an imposition. We have been riding 14 hours straight from Denver. Highway is shut down about 12 miles back, and we are not making it any further tonight." His pale blue eyes moved past her to take in the empty diner. The cracked booths, the flickering lights, the general air of a place that was held together by memory and sheer will. "We have cash for food and coffee," he said, "and you have my word we will not cause any trouble." Every bit of common sense Loretta possessed told her to close the door. These were Hell's Angels. The patches on their jackets were not decorations. They were declarations of a way of life that existed in the spaces between law and chaos, and the men wearing them had faces that bore the evidence of years spent navigating those spaces with their fists and their wills and whatever the situation required. But Loretta Weaver had spent 15 years looking at the faces of strangers who walked through her door at their lowest, and she had learned something that news reports and movies and the frightened whispers of polite society could never teach. She had learned to see past the surface to the thing underneath, which was almost always just a human being who was tired and cold and needed help. The man before her was tired. The men behind him were tired. They had been riding in a killing storm for 14 hours, and they were standing in her parking lot in below-zero wind chill, asking permission to come inside because they were too frozen and too exhausted to go any further. How many, she asked? 23. The man's voice held a quality that surprised her, something careful and raw, at the same time the voice of a man who was holding himself together through discipline alone. I am Gunnar Blackwood, Thunder Ridge chapter. We were coming back from a memorial service for a brother down in Denver. He paused and something moved across his face that might have been grief or might have been the particular fatigue that came from burying someone you loved and then nearly dying in a snowstorm on the way home. We just need somewhere warm to wait it out. Loretta looked past Gunnar at the group assembling behind him. The man directly behind him was older, 55 or so, with sergeant-at-arms embroidered beneath his chapter patch, and tattoos covering every visible inch of both arms in intricate designs that told stories of a life lived at full volume. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the room with the automatic alertness of someone whose job it was to keep everyone safe, a habit so deeply ingrained it had become indistinguishable from personality. Behind him was a man with a shaved head and a spiderweb tattoo on his neck. Behind him, a younger one, barely grown, with nervous eyes and hands that shook from more than just the cold. Come in, Loretta said, stepping back. All of you, before you die out there. The relief that crossed Gunnar Blackwood's face was immediate and genuine, the kind that stripped away every layer of toughness and reputation and left nothing but raw gratitude. Thank you, he said. You have no idea what this means. They filed in one by one, 23 men in frozen leather, each of them massive enough to make the diner's door frame look like it had been built for children. They stomped snow from their boots and shook ice from their shoulders and moved with a surprising carefulness that contradicted everything their appearance suggested. Several of them wiped their boots before stepping onto her floor. One held the door for the man behind him. Another paused to pick up a napkin that had blown off a table in the rush of cold air. They settled into booths and counter stools with the unspoken efficiency of men accustomed to organizing themselves by rank, the older members taking the natural positions, and the younger ones deferring without complaint. Loretta was already moving toward the coffee machine. She had barely enough food to feed 3 people, a nearly empty freezer, 6 eggs, half a bag of flour, some canned soup, the cheap kind, tomato and chicken noodle, a partial bag of frozen hash browns, half a pound of ground beef getting close to its expiration date, 3 cans of beans, a little butter, day-old bread that was not quite stale. It was not enough, not even close to enough. But Loretta Weaver had been feeding people on nothing for 15 years, and she had learned that the secret was not having enough ingredients, but having enough will. Coffee, she announced, already working. I will see what I can find in the kitchen. Sugar and cream are on the counter. Help yourselves. The sounds that followed were the sounds she had spent 15 years listening for. The gurgle of the machine working overtime, the quiet murmur of men grateful for warmth, the particular rustling of people who had stopped being afraid and started being safe. She heard those sounds and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was clenched. She poured mug after mug and carried them to tables and counter stools, and as the men wrapped their frozen hands around the hot ceramics, she watched the transformation happen the way it always did. The hardness in their faces softened. The tension in their shoulders eased. The distance in their eyes closed, replaced by the particular warmth of people who had been given shelter when they needed it most. Gunnar Blackwood had taken the stool nearest the register and held his mug with both hands, thawing slowly. He was watching Loretta with an expression she could not quite read, something between curiosity and the beginning of recognition, as if he were trying to place her in a memory he could not quite access. The sergeant-at-arms sat 2 stools down and nursed his coffee with the quiet intensity of a man who treated every beverage as a meditation. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the room, covering every angle. Loretta had the sense that he could have drawn a floor plan of the diner from memory after 30 seconds inside it. In a back booth, the young one, the nervous one, sat alone. He was 23 at most, with eyes that held shadows that had no business in a face that young. He still had his jacket on frozen leather, draped over tense shoulders. Underneath it, a flannel shirt and a thin sweater that had not been nearly enough for what they had been riding through. Loretta went to work in the kitchen and turned what little she had into something by force of skill and stubbornness. The soup first heated and extended with water and whatever seasoning she could find until it was thin but hot. Then the hash browns cooked crisp on the grill and divided into portions that were small but decent. Then the ground beef mixed with beans and spices into a rough chili that filled the diner with an aroma that made 23 cold men groan with the particular gratitude of people whose bodies had stopped expecting good things and were now recalibrating. She served them the way she had served every customer who had ever sat in these booths with care and attention and the particular grace of a woman who understood that feeding people was about dignity. It was about telling someone that they mattered enough to receive your best effort even when your best effort was canned soup and day-old bread. The bikers ate with a humility that Loretta found quietly humbling. These were men who could intimidate a room by walking into it, and they were eating her cheap soup and canned chili like it was the finest meal they had ever been offered. The young one in the back booth actually stood up when she brought his plate, a reflex of manners that someone had taught him long before the leather and the patches. Loretta noticed it and said nothing and kept moving. Destiny worked alongside her, refilling mugs and clearing plates with the efficiency of 3 years of practice. But Loretta noticed that her hands were not quite steady, and more than once she caught Destiny pulling her phone from her back pocket, glancing at the screen, and then shoving it back with an expression that flickered between fear and anger before settling into the studied blankness she had perfected during those first months at the diner, when every sudden noise made her flinch and every raised voice sent her into the back room with her arms wrapped around herself. Loretta waited until they were both in the kitchen out of earshot. Something wrong? Destiny did not look up from the pot she was stirring. He got out, Destiny said. Her voice was flat and controlled, the voice of someone who had already processed the fear and moved past it into the territory of grim acceptance. Wade, early release, 2 weeks ago. Loretta felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. He has been texting me, Destiny continued. Different numbers every time, but it is always him. Always the same message. She paused, and something in her composure cracked, just a hairline fracture, barely visible. But Loretta saw it. I know where you are. That is what he keeps saying. I know where you are. Have you called the police? And told them what the frustration in Destiny's voice was sharp enough to draw blood. There is no restraining order anymore. It expired last year. The Grand Junction DA said there was not enough evidence to renew it. So right now, as far as the law is concerned, Wade Boone is a free man who is not doing anything wrong. Her voice cracked on the last 2 words, and for a moment the tough, capable young woman who had rebuilt her life from rubble was gone, replaced by the girl who had walked through that door 3 years ago, shaking and bleeding and so scared she could barely form words. Loretta crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled Destiny into her arms. The younger woman stiffened for just a moment in the old reflex, and then she melted into the embrace and pressed her face against Loretta's shoulder. He is not going to touch you, Loretta said. Not in my diner, not in my house, not ever again. You hear me? You cannot promise that. Watch me. They stood like that for a long moment, the two of them in the warm kitchen, while the storm raged outside and 23 Hells Angels ate soup in the dining room. And Loretta held this girl who was not her daughter by blood, but was her daughter in every way that mattered. And she made a promise she was not sure she could keep, but was absolutely certain she would die trying to. When she came back out to the dining room, Gunnar Blackwood was standing at the wall of photographs behind the register, studying them with an attention that seemed more than casual curiosity. There were dozens of them, faded and curling at the edges, pinned to a corkboard that Calvin had hung on their first day of business. Travelers and truckers and families and lone wanderers, all of them smiling, all of them captured in the warm light of the diner during some moment of rest on their journey through the mountains. Calvin was in many of the pictures, his big frame taking up half the frame, his dark skin gleaming under the kitchen lights, his smile so wide it seemed to generate its own warmth. That your husband Gunnar asked without turning around. Calvin, Loretta said. He passed 2 years ago. Gunnar was quiet for a moment, still looking at the photographs. He looks like a man who knew how to take care of people. He was the best at it, better than me. I just learned from watching him. Gunnar turned, and there was something careful in his expression, as if he were handling something fragile he did not want to break. "This place," he said, "how long has it been here?" 15 years. Before that, Calvin drove trucks, long hauls all over the western states. I dispatched for his company. We saved everything we had and put it into this place because Calvin believed that a diner on a mountain highway could be something more than just a place to eat. What did he believe it could be? A beacon, Loretta said. That was his word. A home away from home for anyone who needed it. A place where people found this diner when they needed it most, and we were here for them. Every single time. Something moved in Gunnar's pale blue eyes, too quick to fully identify. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again and looked down at his coffee. "Your husband was a good man," he said finally. "I can tell that just from standing in this room." Before Loretta could respond, the phone rang. She picked up the receiver. Crossroads Diner. The voice was Dennis Keller. Again. Calling back at nearly 9 in the evening. "Mrs. Weaver, I wanted to clarify something from our earlier conversation. The developer has indicated they can proceed with possession within 48 hours of foreclosure. I would be doing you a disservice if I did not make clear that your window is narrowing considerably. 48 hours. I strongly urge you to begin the process of vacating Keller," continued his voice carrying the smooth regret of a man who had delivered this speech many times before. "This is not personal, Mrs. Weaver. It is simply the reality of your financial position." She set the phone down without responding, not hanging it up, just setting it down on the counter, his voice still coming out of it thin and precise, explaining the reality of her financial position to an empty room. Gunnar Blackwood was standing 2 feet away. He had heard everything. "Who was that?" His voice was quiet. "Nobody." Did not sound like nobody. Sounded like somebody threatening to take your home. She turned to face him. His pale blue eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but was not because the anger in them was not directed at her. It was directed at whatever he had heard through that receiver. "It is not your problem," Loretta said. "Lady, you just fed 23 men with food you could not afford and opened your door in a blizzard to people most folks would have called the police on. If someone is threatening to take your home, that is absolutely my problem." Behind Gunnar, the entire dining room had gone still. Cards were held mid-deal. Coffee mugs were suspended halfway to mouths. 23 pairs of eyes were watching the conversation with the focused attention of men who had spent their lives identifying threats and responding to them. "Tell me," Gunnar said. It was not a request. So Loretta told him. She told him about the mortgage payments she could not make and the bank manager who would not negotiate. She told him about Dennis Keller and his manicured hands and his office full of photographs with developers and politicians. She told him about Summit Ridge development and the commercial properties being bought up along Highway 70 for the past 18 months. She told him about the foreclosure notice and the 7 days and the phone call that had just reduced 7 days to 48 hours. She told him about Calvin, about the dream, about the 15 years of serving strangers. She told him about selling the wedding ring and the tools and everything else that could be sold. She told him about the $47 on the counter and what it represented, and when she was finished, she felt hollowed out, emptied like a house after the movers have taken everything. The diner was silent. Every biker in the room had heard every word. Gunnar sat very still for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Loretta with eyes that held something she had not seen in them before. Not pity. Pity was what Dennis Keller offered when he pretended his hands were tied. This was something harder and hotter and more dangerous than pity. "How much?" he said. 15,000, with the late fees and the legal costs. "And this Keller, you believe he is working with the developers?" "I cannot prove it." "You do not need to prove it to me." He stood and reached for his phone. "I am going to make some calls. It is going to take a while." He paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel charged. "Loretta, do not give up on this place. Not tonight. Not yet." He said her name like he was memorizing it, filing it away in whatever internal archive held the things that mattered to him. "The story's not over," he said. Then he pushed through the door into the storm, his phone already pressed to his ear, and Loretta watched him pace back and forth in the parking lot, a dark figure against the white fury of the blizzard, his voice occasionally rising above the wind as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of those calls. Destiny appeared beside her at the window. "What is he doing?" "I do not know," Loretta admitted, "but I think he is trying to help." Why he does not know us. Loretta thought about Calvin, about his belief that kindness was never wasted, that every good deed sent ripples through the world in directions you could never predict, that the light you put out into the world always found somewhere to land. Maybe that is exactly why she said. The storm raged on. The clock ticked past 10, past 11. Gunner stayed outside for nearly an hour, pacing and talking, his leather jacket accumulating a fresh layer of snow that he did not seem to notice. Inside, the bikers settled in for the long haul of waiting. Some dozed in the booths, their massive frames curled uncomfortably into spaces designed for much smaller people. Others played cards by the counter lamps, their voices low and easy, the particular comfortable murmur of men who were accustomed to waiting out hard nights together. The young one, the nervous one, had fallen asleep with his head on the table, exhaustion finally winning the argument with whatever nervous energy had been keeping him upright. The sergeant-at-arms noticed. Without a word, he took off his own leather jacket and draped it over the kid's shoulders. The gesture was so gentle, so entirely at odds with the man's appearance and reputation, that Loretta felt her throat tighten watching it. "He reminds me of my son," the man said quietly when he saw her watching. "Same age, same stubborn streak. Always trying to prove he belongs somewhere. Where is your son now?" "Fort Bragg, 3rd deployment. Comes home next month if everything goes right." His voice held the weight of a father's worry, the kind that lived in the bones and never went away, no matter how old your children got or how strong they proved themselves to be. "What is your name?" Loretta asked. Vance Dalton." "And the kid?" Finn Slater. "He is new, but he is going to be all right." Vance said it with the particular certainty of a man who had learned to read people the way some men read weather by long experience and careful attention and a lifetime of being right when it mattered. "You never stop worrying about them," Loretta said. "Even when they are grown, even when they are tougher than you ever were." "No," Vance agreed. "You never do." By midnight, the diner had settled into a strange warm quiet. The storm continued to pound the walls, but inside there was coffee and warmth, and the particular peace that came from a room full of people who had stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were, which was tired and cold and grateful and human. Loretta sat behind the counter, too wired to sleep, watching the snow pile higher against the windows. She was thinking about Dennis Keller in 48 hours and the 2 years she had spent keeping Calvin's light burning alone. She was thinking about Destiny upstairs with her phone and Wade Boone's texts. She was thinking about $47 and 15 years of work and what it meant that all of it could be undone by a man in a camel hair overcoat with a developer's phone number in his outbox. She was still sitting there when Vance Dalton appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving quietly so as not to wake the others. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter across from her with the easy manner of a man who was comfortable in silence and did not need to fill it with noise. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a while. Loretta nodded. He looked down at his mug for a moment as if deciding something. 13 years ago. Did you ever help a trucker who was having chest pains, big man, red beard, drove for Western Mountain Transport? The memory arrived like a physical force, sudden and complete. A cold November evening, the diner nearly empty. She had gone out to check the dumpster and found a man slumped against the driver's side door of his rig, his big body folded in on itself, his face twisted with pain as he clutched his chest with both hands. "Hank," Loretta said. "His name was Hank." "Hank Gallagher," Vance said quietly. "He is my brother-in-law. Married my sister Patricia 5 years ago. He tells that story at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every time anyone will listen. The angel in the mountains. How you found him and called 911 and then drove him to the hospital yourself when the ambulance could not get through the rock slide on the highway. How you stayed with him all night and called his wife and paid for his parking when he could not find his wallet." Loretta felt heat rise in her cheeks. That was not anything special. He was having a heart attack in my parking lot. What was I supposed to do, leave him there? Most people would have called 911 and gone back inside. You drove a stranger 30 miles through a rock slide to the emergency room and sat with him until his family arrived. Vance's voice was steady and precise, the voice of a man stating something he had thought about for a long time. "That is not nothing, Loretta. That is everything." She did not know how to respond to that. She had lived so long with the daily grind of survival, with the bills and the broken equipment and the empty booths, that she had forgotten to measure her life by anything other than what she owed and what she lacked. The idea that she had been accumulating a different kind of currency, one measured in lives touched and kindnesses given, had not occurred to her in a very long time. Vance turned toward the dining room where the bikers were beginning to stir in the gray dawn light. "Brothers," he called. His voice carried the authority of rank and years. "Wake up. We need to talk." Within minutes, 23 men were gathered around the counter, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. All of them holding coffee that Vance had brewed, all of them watching him with the focused attention of men who trusted what was coming next. "I know this woman," Vance said. "Or rather, my family knows this woman. She saved my brother-in-law's life 13 years ago. Drove him to the hospital herself in a rock slide. Stayed with him all night. Never asked for anything in return." He looked around at the assembled group. "I have a feeling some of you might have your own stories." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds before Cobb, the man with the spiderweb tattoo on his neck, raised his hand with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had something to say and was not going to wait for a better moment. "5 years ago," he said, "my daughter had been in a wreck on the interstate outside Denver. I was coming from the other direction out of my mind, with worry, and I stopped here because my phone was dead. She let me call the hospital and told me the fastest route. And when I was too shook up to think about eating, she packed me a sandwich and 2 bottles of water and put them in my saddlebag without me asking." He looked at Loretta directly, and his cold eyes were not cold anymore. "My daughter's fine. She is 22 now, studying nursing at CU Boulder. She always asked me to say thank you to the diner lady if I ever passed through again." Slade Riggs spoke next. His rough voice was softened by memory, by something that had been sitting untouched for years and was finally being allowed out. 8 years back, my chain snapped in a storm just like this one, about a mile east of here. I walked through the snow until I found this place half frozen and ready to give up. She and her husband Calvin took me in and fed me, and Calvin spent 4 hours in the garage helping me fix my bike. Would not take a cent for the parts or the labor, said that was what neighbors did. He paused. I was not his neighbor. I was a stranger in a leather jacket with a wrap sheet as long as my arm. He treated me like family anyway. One by one, the stories came. A rider from the Phoenix chapter whose bike had broken down and who had been given 2 nights of shelter, no questions asked, no debt incurred. A biker from Salt Lake City who had lost his wallet and been allowed to eat on a handshake, promise he had never had to keep, but had driven back 300 miles the following spring to honor. A man who had been riding through grief after his mother's funeral and had found in the warmth of a corner booth the first real moment of peace he had felt in weeks. A rider who had been stranded in a winter storm 4 years ago and had been given shelter and coffee and a phone charger and a kind word at 3 in the morning when the cold had gotten inside his head as much as his bones. Each story was different. Each one shared the same essential truth. Loretta Weaver, and before her, Loretta and Calvin Weaver together had spent 15 years opening their door to anyone who needed it, feeding anyone who was hungry, and treating every person who walked through that door with a dignity and kindness that cost them nothing but their time and their food and their sleep, and yet was worth more than they could have possibly imagined. Loretta stood behind the counter and listened to these men. These feared and dangerous and deeply misunderstood men described the ways in which she had changed their lives through acts so small she had forgotten them entirely the moment they were over. The tears came without warning. She had not cried since Calvin's funeral, had not allowed herself that luxury, because crying did not pay the mortgage or keep the lights on. But now the tears came and would not stop, and she wept for all of it. For Calvin and the dream, in the 15 years, in the $47, in the simple, overwhelming realization that none of it had been wasted. Not one single moment of it had been wasted. It was Finn Slater who broke through the wave of emotion. The youngest biker had been sitting at the edge of the group, quiet and pale, his hands clasped in his lap so tightly the tendons stood out against his skin. When the other stories had been told, and the room had settled into respectful silence, he stood up. His voice, when it came, was barely louder than the wind outside. "You might not remember me," he said, "but I was here 3 years ago, and I need to tell you something." Every head in the diner turned toward him. Finn swallowed, and Loretta could see the effort it cost him to hold his voice steady. He was so young, barely grown, with eyes that held shadows that had no business in a face that age. "I had dropped out of a school," he said. "My parents had kicked me out, lost my job, my apartment, everything I had. I was riding west with no plan and no money, and no real reason to keep going. I had maybe $4 when I stopped to here because my tank was almost empty, and I did not know what else to do." He paused. The silence in the diner was absolute, the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people is holding its breath. I was not stopping for gas. He let that sit for a moment, and the words settled into the room and changed the air. I was stopping because I had decided this was going to be my last stop. I was going to eat one more meal if anyone would give me one, and then I was going to ride up into the mountains and find a place high enough, and I was going to end it. I had made up my mind. I was done. He looked at Loretta directly. But you served me a full meal, coffee, a slice of pie, and when I tried to pay with my last $4, you looked at me and you said, honey, you look like you are having the worst day of your life, and this meal is on the house. The tears were running down Finn's face now, and he made no attempt to wipe them away. His voice had gone ragged and raw, but he kept going. Then you asked me where I was headed, and when I said I did not know, you said something I have never forgotten, not once in 3 years. You said, sometimes not knowing where you are going is the first step to finding where you belong. Then you gave me a business card. A friend of yours in Salt Lake City, you said, who might have work for someone willing to learn. Loretta remembered. The memory surfaced slowly like something rising from deep water. A skinny kid with hollow cheeks and empty eyes, and a motorcycle that sounded like it was held together with hope and nothing else. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who had run out of road, who had stopped looking for a destination. She had given him a piece of and a business card and a sentence she had heard Calvin say 100 times to 100 different people who needed to hear it. That man in Salt Lake City hired me, Finn said. He became like a father to me, helped me get my GED, then into community college. Introduced me to these guys. He gestured at the bikers beside him. Gave me a family when I did not have one. He looked at Loretta, and his young face was stripped of every pretense, every performance of toughness or ease. You saved my life, Loretta. Not just by feeding me, not just by giving me that phone number, but by reminding me that there were still people in this world who cared about a stranger. That one woman in a diner on a mountain highway could look at a kid she had never met and see someone worth saving. The room was silent except for the storm. Gunnar Blackwood, who had come back inside sometime during the testimonials and stood quietly at the edge of the group, listening now, crossed the dining room to stand beside Finn. He placed one heavy hand on the young man's shoulder and looked at Loretta. There are more stories, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. A lot more. You have been a beacon on this highway for 15 years, Loretta. You have touched more lives than you can possibly count. I just served food, Loretta whispered. I just tried to be decent to people. In a world that has made decency expensive, Gunnar replied, that is the most extraordinary thing a person can do. The morning wore on and the storm continued. The radio confirmed what they already knew. Highway 70 closed in both directions. No estimate on reopening. The snow had not stopped, but it had slowed enough that the world beyond the diner windows was no longer a solid wall of white. Shapes were beginning to emerge. The gas pumps buried under drifts. The roads still invisible. The mountains looming gray and vast behind curtains of falling snow. Inside the diner, the mood had shifted. The bikers were no longer just waiting out a storm. Loretta could feel it in the way they moved, in the low conversations conducted in pairs and small groups, in the looks exchanged across the room that carried information she could not decode. Gunnar had been on his phone since the stories ended, stepping outside every 20 minutes for calls that left him either grimly satisfied or deeply focused. She could not always tell which. She was behind the counter, stretching what remained of their food into something resembling lunch, when Destiny appeared at her elbow, phone extended screen turned outward. He texted again. The message was from a number Destiny did not recognize. The words were unmistakable in their intent. I know you are at that diner on 70. Snow will not last forever, baby. See you real soon. Loretta felt the cold move through her like a draft through a cracked window. When, an hour ago, Destiny's voice was controlled flat. The voice of a woman who had trained herself not to panic because panicking did not help. And she had learned that lesson in the most brutal possible classroom. He knows exactly where I am, Loretta. We need to do something. Before Loretta could respond, a voice came from behind them. Show me the text. Vance Dalton was standing 3 feet away. He had heard everything. His tattooed arms were crossed over his chest, and his face held the expression of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. Destiny hesitated for just a moment, then handed over the phone. Vance scrolled through the messages with the careful attention of someone cataloging evidence, his expression growing darker with each swipe. How long has this been going on? 2 weeks, Destiny said. Different numbers every time, but it is always him. And before the text, before he went in, Destiny reached up and pulled the collar of her shirt to one side, revealing the scar on her left shoulder. Round and puckered. The unmistakable signature of a cigarette pressed into flesh and held there. Vance's jaw tightened so hard Loretta could hear his teeth grind. He handed the phone back to Destiny and walked into the dining room without another word. Loretta watched through the service window as he approached Gunnar and spoke in a voice too low to carry. She watched Gunnar's expression change, watched the pale blue eyes go from focus to something harder and more dangerous in the space of a heartbeat, the way a quiet afternoon can change when you hear the first rumble of a serious storm. Within minutes, the diner had transformed. The card game stopped. The casual conversations ended. 23 men moved from rest to readiness with the silent efficiency of a unit receiving orders, and Loretta understood for the first time exactly what they were. Not just a motorcycle club, a brotherhood bound by codes and oaths that ran deeper than anything the law recognized. And right now, that brotherhood had identified a threat and was positioning itself to meet it. Gunnar found Loretta in the kitchen. "Tell me about this man, everything you know." She told him. Wade Boone, 31 years old from Grand Junction, had been in a relationship with Destiny for 2 years before she ran. History of violence stretching back to his teens. Served 20 months for aggravated assault after he put Destiny in the hospital with a broken jaw, 2 cracked ribs, and the cigarette burn that had left a scar on her shoulder. Released 2 weeks ago on good behavior. Good behavior. Gunnar repeated the 2 words the way a man handles something he finds contaminated. The system will not protect her, Loretta said. The restraining order expired and they would not renew it. The DAA said there was not enough evidence of ongoing threat. Meanwhile, he sends her texts from burner phones and she cannot sleep, and she keeps a knife under her pillow. She is 22 years old and she has already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime. Gunnar listened to all of it with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the kitchen walls as if he could see through the storm to wherever Wade Boone was at this moment. Then he looked at Loretta and his voice was very quiet and very certain. He is not going to touch her. He did not say it as a promise. He said it the way you state a fact about the physical world, a condition of reality that had already been determined and now simply needed to be implemented. The afternoon crept forward under the weight of the storm. The snow had slowed. Shapes were emerging beyond the diner windows, the buried gas pumps, the mountains gray and vast behind curtains of falling snow. Loretta was behind the counter when she heard the sound. Not motorcycles this time. The high, angry whine of a pickup truck engine pushed too hard, followed by the crunch of tires on packed gravel. A dark green pickup with Grand Junction plates pulled into the parking lot at an angle that blocked the entrance, and 3 men climbed out. The driver was tall and lean, with the wiry build of someone who burned his energy on anger rather than exercise. Narrow-faced, sharp features, close-set eyes that moved constantly as if cataloging exits and obstacles. A thin mouth that seemed incapable of any expression except displeasure. He wore a denim jacket over a hoodie not nearly enough for the weather, and he walked toward the diner with the loose, aggressive stride of a man who had been coiling himself toward this moment for 2 weeks. Behind him came 2 others, bigger, slower, the kind of men who were useful precisely because they did not think before they acted. She did not need to be told who the driver was. She knew from the way Destiny's entire body went rigid beside her, from the small, involuntary sound that escaped from somewhere deep in the younger woman's throat, from the way Destiny's hands gripped the counter edge so hard the tendons stood out beneath her skin like cables under tension. Wade Boone walked through the front door of Crossroads Diner like he owned the place. He stood in the entrance, snow melting on his denim shoulders, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they found Destiny. Found her in less than a second, the way a predator finds what it has been tracking. His thin mouth twisted into the shape of a smile that contained nothing that resembled warmth. There she is. His voice was light and casual, the voice of a man who believed this situation was already resolved in his favor. "Hey, baby. Miss me?" Destiny did not speak, did not move. The color had drained from her face so completely that her brown skin had taken on an ashen quality, and her hands were shaking in the way Loretta recognized from those first terrible weeks, the shaking that came not from cold, but from the body remembering what it had suffered and preparing against all of its will to suffer it again. Wade took a step forward. "You need to leave," Loretta said. Her voice came out steady and clear, and it surprised her because everything inside her was shaking as badly as Destiny's hands. Right now, get out of my diner. Wade turned his attention to Loretta for the first time. His close-set eyes assessed her with the casual cruelty of someone who sorted the world into things that were useful and things that were in the way. Who are you, the mother she never had? He laughed, a short, ugly sound that had no humor in it. Mind your business, Grandma. This is between me and my girl. She is not your girl. She has not been your girl since you put her in the hospital. Now I am telling you one more time, get out of my diner. Wade's expression shifted. The false smile disappeared, replaced by something flat and cold and infinitely more honest about what he actually was. Or what? The two words hung in the air for precisely 2 seconds. Then 23 chairs scraped against linoleum as 23 men stood up simultaneously. The sound was not loud exactly, but the collective movement of 23 large bodies rising from seated positions in unison created a physical wave that passed through the room like a shock, like the pressure change before something massive falls. The leather creaked, the floor vibrated, the air thickened. Every booth and counter stool in the diner emptied at once, and the men who had been sitting in them materialized between Wade Boone and the counter in an arc that had somehow assembled without anyone appearing to move with particular urgency. Wade Boone froze. His two companions went absolutely still. The blood drained from the shaved one's face so fast it was almost visible. The shorter one took an involuntary step backward, his eyes moving from face to face as the full dimensions of what he had walked into became clear to him. 23 Hell's Angels, standing in a loose semicircle, every one of them looking at the 3 men by the door with an expression that was not angry, which would have been less frightening, but calm. The particular calm of men who had been in situations like this before and knew exactly how they resolved. Gunnar Blackwood stood directly in front of Wade. Up close, the president of the Thunder Ridge chapter was a study in controlled menace. His pale blue eyes were fixed on Wade with the focused intensity of a man running calculations that were not emotional, but physical, measuring distances and angles and the precise amount of force that would be required to end the situation in each of the several ways he was considering ending it. Vance Dalton had positioned himself to Gunnar's right, tattooed arms loose at his sides, his face holding the particular calm that came before violence, like the stillness before thunder. Slade Riggs stood to the left, his massive frame blocking the path to the door, his catcher mitt hands hanging open and ready. And behind them, filling every gap and covering every angle, stood the rest. Cobb with his spiderweb tattoo and his cold eyes now fixed and hard. Finn Slater, the youngest, his face white, but his stance solid, standing with the brothers who had given him a family. I am going to explain your situation to you, Gunnar said. His voice was almost gentle. Because I think you may have misread the room. Wade's eyes were moving frantically now, counting leather jackets and patches, and the kind of scars that told you exactly what these men were capable of when they decided a situation required it. You walked into a diner, Gunnar continued, that is under the protection of every Hells Angels chapter west of the Mississippi. The woman you came here to terrorize is under that protection. The girl behind the counter is under that protection. The walls, the floor, every single thing in this room is under that protection. He took one step forward, just one, but it was enough to make Wade Boone step back. Now you have 2 choices. Gunnar's voice remained quiet, almost conversational, which made it more frightening than shouting could ever be. You can walk out that door right now, get into your truck, and drive back to Grand Junction. You will never contact Destiny again. You will never text her, never call her, never come within 500 miles of this diner or any place she happens to be. You will forget she exists. You will forget this diner exists. You will forget this night ever happened. He paused, and the pause was more frightening than any explicit threat could have been. Or you can stay, and we can discuss this further. The diner was so quiet that Loretta could hear the snow hitting the windows, could hear the slow tick of the clock above the register, could hear the shallow breathing of the woman standing rigid behind her. Wade Boone was not a stupid man. He was violent, and he was cruel, and he derived pleasure from the suffering of people weaker than himself. But he was not stupid. He looked at the 23 faces arrayed before him, and he performed the same calculation that any predator performs when it encounters a force larger and more dangerous than itself. The calculation had only one answer. We are leaving, he said. His voice had gone flat and careful. Yes, Gunnar agreed. You are. Wade turned toward the door. His two companions were already ahead of him, moving with the urgency of men who had been given a very clear picture of what the alternative looked like and wanted no part of it. Wade paused at the threshold and looked back over his shoulder, his close-set eyes finding Destiny one last time. This is not over, he said. Vance Dalton moved so fast that Loretta did not see it happen. One moment he was standing beside Gunnar. The next his hand was closed around Wade Boone's forearm with a grip that made the younger man's knees buckle visibly. Vance leaned close to Wade's ear and spoke in a voice that was so quiet nothing carried more than 2 feet. Whatever he said, it took less than 15 seconds. When he was done, he released Wade Boone's arm and stepped back. Wade Boone stood in the doorway for a moment, and the expression on his face was one Loretta had never seen on any human being. It was not fear exactly. It was the particular expression of a man who has just understood completely, and finally the full scope of what he has walked into and what will follow him if he does not walk away and stay away and never look back. He nodded once, a single small nod that carried the weight of a decision made irrevocably. Then he was out the door, and his companions were with him, and the truck engine roared and the tires spun on packed snow, and the dark green pickup was fishtailing out of the parking lot and disappearing into the white nothing of Highway 70. The diner exhaled. Destiny stood behind the counter motionless, her hand still gripping the edge. Loretta went to her and gathered her up the way she had 3 years ago, pulling the younger woman into her arms while the tension broke and the tears came. Not the quiet tears of resignation, but the hot, shaking sobs of someone who had just watched the monster under her bed get dragged into the light and shown to be smaller than the fear it had created. He is gone, Loretta murmured. He is gone, baby. Gunnar appeared beside them. Not for now, he said. Permanently. I have people in Grand Junction who will make sure Wade Boone understands that his new reality includes a very long list of places he cannot go and people he cannot contact. If he so much as thinks about you, we will know. And he knows that now. Destiny looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. Why would you do this for someone you do not even know? Gunnar glanced at Loretta and something passed between them that Loretta could not quite name. Because someone showed me a long time ago that strangers are just family you have not met yet. And the woman who raised you opened her door to us. That makes you one of ours. Destiny broke down again, and this time when Loretta held her, she felt something that had been wound tight in the girl for 3 years finally slowly begin to loosen. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to breathe. The afternoon settled into an exhausted calm. Several of the bikers approached Destiny over the next hour, not with words but with small gestures of acknowledgement and solidarity. Cobb brought her a cup of coffee without being asked. Slade gave her a quiet nod that carried more weight than any speech. Finn sat down across from her in a booth and said nothing for 10 minutes, just present his silent companionship communicating something that no combination of words could have achieved. It was during this quiet period, with the storm finally beginning to lose its fury and the first pale suggestion of afternoon sun breaking through the clouds, that Gunnar Blackwood paused at the wall of photographs behind the register. He had glanced at them the previous night, briefly, but now he stopped and truly looked, his pale blue eyes moving slowly from picture to picture, with an increasing intensity that shifted over 30 seconds from casual to searching to something Loretta could not name from across the room. She watched him from behind the counter without fully understanding what she was seeing, until she saw him stop. His entire body went still. Not the controlled stillness of a man making a tactical assessment, the absolute involuntary stillness of a man who has just been struck on by something so unexpected that his nervous system needs a full moment to determine whether what it is receiving is real or imagined. He was staring at a photograph near the bottom of the corkboard, one of Loretta's favorites taken in the diner's first year. Calvin stood behind the counter, his big frame filling the frame, his dark skin gleaming under the kitchen lights, that smile on his face that could warm a room faster than any furnace. He was wearing his Western Mountain Transport cap and his favorite flannel shirt, one arm around Loretta, the other extended toward the camera, in a gesture of welcome, as if he were inviting the entire world to come in and sit down and rest a while. Gunnar reached up and touched the photograph with the tip of his finger. The motion was so careful, so reverent, it looked almost like a man touching something sacred. Loretta, his voice came out strange, rough and thin at the same time, like something was pressing his throat from the inside. This man, this is your husband. That is Calvin. Yes, Calvin Weaver. Yes, Gunnar turned to face her. And the expression on his face was one she had never seen on any human being. It was shock and grief and recognition and gratitude and something else, something deeper than all of those, something that lived in the space between the debts we owe and the debts we can never repay, the space where the most important moments of our lives reside. 20 years ago, he said, and his voice was shaking now. Actually shaking this man who had faced a blizzard and stared down a violent predator without flinching. 20 years ago, I was riding alone through Montana, back road outside Billings. I had gotten into something I should not have gotten into with some people who did not appreciate my involvement. The diner had gone quiet. Every biker in the room was listening. They caught up to me on a stretch of highway with no witnesses and no law for 50 miles in any direction. They beat me half to death and left me in a ditch. Broken leg, 4 cracked ribs, punctured lung, a face so swollen I could not see out of either eye. He had not looked away from the photograph. It was November, temperature dropping towards 0. I would have been dead by morning. The room was so still that Loretta could hear the snow settling on the roof. A truck pulled over. A big rig, Western Mountain Transport on the door. And this man. He touched the photograph with the tip of his finger, the same careful gesture as before. This man climbed down from that cab and found me in that ditch. He did not hesitate. Not for 1 second. He picked me up, all 230 pounds of me, and carried me to his truck, wrapped me in blankets, and drove 90 miles to the nearest hospital. Loretta felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She reached for the counter edge to steady herself. He stayed 3 days, Gunnar continued. 3 days sitting in that hospital room with a stranger he had pulled out of a ditch and whose name he did not know. He paid the medical bills. He paid for everything. And when I could finally open my eyes enough to see him, I looked up at this face. He touched the photograph again, and I saw the warmest smile I had ever seen in my life. And he said to me, "Brother, you are going to be all right. You are going to get through this." And I believed him. Because you could not look at that smile and not believe. Tears were running down Gunnar Blackwood's weathered face. The president of Thunder Ridge MC stood in the middle of a mountain diner and wept without shame or apology, without any attempt to hide or minimize or contain what was happening to him. I never knew his name, he said. He would not tell me. I asked him 100 times and he just smiled and said it did not matter. Said he was just a trucker passing through, doing what any decent person would do. But I remembered one thing. I remembered him talking about his wife and the diner they were going to open someday. A place in the mountains, a beacon he called it, a light for travelers. Gunnar looked at Loretta and his eyes held 20 years of searching. I have been looking for him ever since. Every highway, every truck stop, every diner between here and Montana. I told every chapter in the western states to keep watch for a diner run by a black couple on a mountain highway. 20 years, Loretta. 20 years of looking for the man who saved my life so I could look him in the eye and say thank you. The silence in the diner was complete, the kind of silence that happens only when a room full of people is holding its breath around something that feels too fragile to survive being spoken too quickly. And now I am standing in his diner, Gunnar whispered, and he is gone. And the woman he loved is about to lose everything he built. His voice had steadied. Something had hardened in it, not with anger, but with purpose. And I swear to you on his memory and on every mile of road I have ever ridden, that is not going to happen. Loretta could not speak, could not move, could not do anything except stand in the diner her husband had dreamed into existence and stare at this man who carried the memory of Calvin's kindness like a wound that had never been meant to heal, only to guide, and that had guided him here 20 years and 1,000 miles later to this diner and this woman in this moment. It was destiny who broke the silence. She had been standing at the edge of the group listening, and now she stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. He knew, she said. Calvin always said this place would bring the right people at the right time. And Loretta Loretta, who had spent 2 years believing that Calvin's dream had died with him, who had spent 7 days believing that everything they had built was about to be taken away by a man with manicured hands and a developer's phone number, who had spent one impossible night feeding strangers with her last $47, because that was what Calvin would have wanted her to do. Loretta Weaver looked at the photograph of her husband, and she laughed. She laughed because it was absurd and beautiful and impossible and absolutely true. She laughed because Calvin, that stubborn, optimistic, generous man who had never met a stranger he could not turn into a friend, had reached across 20 years and the divide between the living and the dead to send her exactly what she needed at exactly the moment she needed it most. Keep the light on, baby. Keep the light on. And in the warm amber glow of Crossroads Diner, surrounded by 23 Hells Angels who were crying and laughing and pounding each other's shoulders, Loretta Weaver kept the light on. The hours that followed were the strangest and most extraordinary of Loretta's life. The revelation about Calvin had unlocked something in the group, a sense of purpose that went beyond gratitude or charity into the territory of sacred obligation. These men had ridden through a killing storm and found themselves in the one place on earth where every thread of their separate histories converged, and the convergence had transformed them from a group of stranded travelers into something that felt to Loretta almost like an army gathering itself before dawn. Gunnar spent the rest of the afternoon on his phone. He was no longer just making calls. He was mobilizing. Loretta caught fragments of conversations. Chapter names she recognized from news reports: Oakland, Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and every conversation followed the same pattern. A brief explanation, a long silence on the other end, and then a response that invariably included the words when and how many. Vance Dalton had taken charge of logistics with the methodical efficiency of a man who had spent his life organizing operations that could not afford to fail. He produced a notebook from somewhere and was making lists in a small, precise hand. Phone numbers, amounts, arrival times. The infrastructure of a rescue being assembled in real time from the raw materials of brotherhood and debt, and 20 years of a promise owed. Slade Riggs had positioned the younger bikers at windows and doors with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to explain himself to be understood. The confrontation with Wade Boone had put everyone on alert, and the Thunder Ridge men had shifted into a mode that was less hospitality and more fortification. Destiny had retreated to the kitchen, where Loretta found her sitting on the cot with her phone in her hand, staring at the blank screen. No new messages from Wade. The silence should have been comforting. It was not. "He is not coming back," Loretta said. "You do not know that. I know what I saw in his face when Vance whispered to him. Whatever Vance said, it worked. That man is not coming back." "What did Vance say to him?" "I do not know," Loretta admitted. "But whatever it was, I am grateful for it." They sat together in the warmth of the kitchen while the storm settled outside, and the distant murmur of 23 men planning something enormous created around them a cocoon of safety that Loretta wished she could bottle and keep for every hard night that had ever come and every hard night that was still ahead. Loretta, Destiny said after a long silence. "Yes, baby. I want to do something with my life. Something that matters. Like what you do. Like what Calvin did. You already do something that matters. You survived. I want to do more than survive." Destiny's voice had steadied and taken on a weight it had not carried before. "I want to fight for women like me. Women who cannot get a restraining order because the system says there is not enough evidence. Women who sleep with knives under their pillows because the law tells them to wait until something actually happens before it can protect them. I want to be on the other side of that desk. I want to be the person who says, 'I believe you. Tell me everything.'" Loretta looked at this young woman she had raised for 3 years and saw something she had not seen before. Not the frightened girl who had stumbled through the door with bruises and a flinch. Not even the tough survivor who had rebuilt herself from wreckage. Something new, something fiercer. A woman who had been forged in fire and was ready to walk back into it, not as a victim, but as someone who intended to change the conditions that created victims in the first place. "Then you fight," Loretta said, "and I will be right behind you every step of the way." Outside, the storm was finally breaking. The snow had thinned to scattered flurries, and through the gaps in the clouds, Loretta could see the first stars she had seen in 2 days, cold and bright and impossibly distant. She walked to the front window and looked out at the parking lot where 23 motorcycles sat buried under white, their chrome invisible beneath drifts, waiting for the morning that would free them. Gunnar appeared beside her on the porch. "Tomorrow," she said. "What is coming tomorrow, Gunnar?" He smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, the smile reached all the way to his eyes. "Everything, Loretta. Everything is coming tomorrow." She did not ask him to explain. She did not need to. She stood at the window of her husband's diner and watched the stars emerge from behind the clouds, and felt in her bones and her blood and the deep, quiet center of herself that something was shifting. Something that had been broken for a longer time was about to be made whole. The night settled over the mountains like a blanket, and in the warm light of Crossroads, Diner 23 Hells Angels slept the sleep of men who had found a purpose worth waking for. And Loretta Weaver sat in a booth number 4 with her hands flat on the table where Calvin's hands used to rest, and she did not sleep because she did not want to miss a single moment of whatever was coming next. The first engine sounded at 6:47 in the morning. Loretta was already standing behind the counter, where she had been standing since 5 brewing coffee and watching the darkness thin toward gray. She heard it before she saw it, a single deep rumble cutting through the cold morning air, followed by another, then another, until the sound multiplied and layered and built into something that was no longer the sound of individual engines, but a collective voice, a chorus of chrome and steel that made the diner's windows vibrate in their frames. She walked to the front door and opened it. The highway had been cleared. Not perfectly, but enough. And on that cleared highway, coming from both directions, east and west, simultaneously was a river of motorcycles flowing toward Crossroads Diner, like tributaries converging on a dam. They came in formation, tight and disciplined groups riding with the precision of men who had spent their lives on the road and knew how to move as one. Their headlights cut through the gray morning like a constellation descending from the sky to the earth, and the sound of their engines echoed off the mountain walls and filled the valley with a thunder that shook the ground beneath Loretta's feet. She counted them as they turned into the parking lot. 20, 30, 40. The lot filled and the bikes began lining up along the shoulder of the highway, stretching in both directions, chrome and leather forming a metallic border drawn across the landscape. 50, 60. Still more coming engines, still sounding from around the curve of the mountain where the highway bent east. Behind her, the 23 Thunder Ridge bikers were awake and moving, pulling on their jackets, straightening their patches, arranging themselves in the parking lot in a formation she understood was ceremonial, a receiving line for the arriving chapters. Gunner stood beside her on the porch, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his pale blue eyes reflecting the headlights of the approaching bikes, with an expression that held both satisfaction and something deeper, a kind of wonder, as if even he had not fully anticipated what his phone calls had set in motion. "How many?" Loretta whispered. Last count was 87, from every chapter between here and the coast. 87. The number hit her like a wave. 87 Hells Angels riding through the aftermath of a blizzard in the pre-dawn darkness as went converging on her diner, because Gunner Blackwood had made phone calls in a storm and told them a story about a woman who had spent 15 years being a light for strangers. And every single one of them had heard that story and decided they needed to be here. The first of the arriving riders dismounted. He was enormous, easily 6'5", with arms that looked designed for a larger species and a face that combined the weathered dignity of age with the unmistakable authority of someone who led by force of presence alone. His jacket bore the Oakland patch, and the word president was embroidered beneath his chapter name in letters that had been earned through decades. Brock Hendricks, Gunner said quietly beside her, Oakland chapter. Brock Hendricks crossed the parking lot with steps that were too light for his massive frame and stopped before Loretta with deep-set brown eyes that held the particular warmth of a man who had learned through hard decades that kindness was not weakness, but its opposite. 23 years ago, Brock said, his voice a deep baritone that carried without effort. You found me passed out in your parking lot, hypothermia. My bike had gone down 3 miles east, and I crawled to the nearest light I could find. He gestured at the diner's neon sign still buzzing faintly in the morning gray. You called the ambulance, rode with me to the hospital, called my wife to tell her I was alive. He extended a hand that could have palmed a basketball, and when he took Loretta's hand, his grip was careful and gentle. I owe you my life, Mrs. Weaver. I have been waiting 23 years for the chance to say so in person. I remember you, Loretta said. You were so cold. I thought you were dead when I first saw you. Damn near was. Would have been if not for you. Behind Brock, the other riders were dismounting and assembling. Patches she recognized from Gunner's calls. Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Reno, Portland. Men who had ridden through the night from cities across the western United States. Men who in other circumstances would not share a parking lot, now nodding to each other with the grudging respect of soldiers from different units who had been called to the same mission. Helmets came off. Jackets were straightened. Small groups formed and reformed, the natural social choreography of men who shared a culture and a code, even if they did not share a chapter. The next vehicle to arrive was not a motorcycle, but a pickup truck with Wyoming plates. The man who climbed out was big and red-bearded, with a grin wide enough to split his weathered face in two, and the particular energy of someone who had been waiting 13 years for a moment that had finally arrived. Loretta Weaver. Hank Gallagher boomed across the parking lot, his voice carrying over the rumble of engines and the cold morning air. You beautiful, beautiful angel. He reached her in 4 strides and swept her into a hug that lifted her feet clean off the ground. When he set her down, he was already reaching back into his truck, pulling out box after box of supplies. Coffee, sugar, flour, eggs, bacon, bread and butter, and canned goods. Everything a diner needed to feed an army, which was exactly what had arrived on her doorstep in the gray December morning. Brought provisions, Hank announced. Figured you might be running a little low on supplies given the circumstances. He winked at Gunnar, who shook his head with the expression of a man whose plans were coming together in exactly the ways he had intended. The morning unfolded with the organized momentum of men who had been given a mission and intended to complete it with the same focus they brought to everything in their lives. The bikers sorted themselves by chapter, each group falling in with its own leadership, and the parking lot became a sea of chrome and leather so vast that it spilled onto the highway shoulder and forced the few passing cars to slow and stare. Loretta moved through the crowd in a state that was not quite waking and not quite dreaming, accepting handshakes and brief embraces and stories from men whose lives she had touched in ways she had never imagined. A writer from Phoenix, whose daughter she had helped route to a Denver hospital on the worst night of his life. A biker from the Portland chapter who had been stranded in a summer breakdown and given shelter for 3 days without charge. A man from the Reno chapter who had stopped at Crossroads on the worst night of his life and found in the warmth of a corner booth and a cup of coffee, and a woman who listened the reason he kept driving instead of turning around. Each story was a thread, and as the morning progressed, Loretta began to see the tapestry they formed together. 15 years, thousands of travelers, countless small acts of kindness, each one forgotten the moment it was performed, each one carrying forward through the lives of the people it touched, creating ripples that traveled distances she could not have imagined returning now, all at once in the form of 87 men who had ridden through a blizzard's aftermath for a woman they had never met. It was mid-morning when Gunnar called the group to order. The bikers assembled in the parking lot, 87 men standing in rows that stretched from the diner's front door to the highway. The morning sun had finally broken through, and it caught the chrome of their motorcycles and the metal of their patches and transformed the parking lot into something that looked to Loretta like a field of armored knights gathered before something worth fighting for. Gunnar stood on the front step, flanked by Brock Hendricks and Vance Dalton, and addressed the assembly with the composed authority of a man who was accustomed to being heard. Brothers, you all know why you are here. You know the story. A woman spent 15 years being the person most of us forgot how to be. She opened her door. She served her food. She gave her time and her money and her kindness to anyone who walked through that door, and she never once asked for anything in return. Now a bank manager is trying to take her home to make a profit for a developer who does not care about the people on this highway. And we are here to say that is not going to happen. A rumble of agreement moved through the crowd, low and deep, like the sound of their engines idling, the sound of collective will finding a direction. Gunnar produced a thick envelope and held it up. He opened it and counted the bills with deliberate precision, slowly enough that every person present could understand the number. $68,000. Cash. From every chapter represented here. The number hit Loretta like a physical force. She actually staggered, and Destiny caught her arm and held her steady. This is too much, Loretta whispered. I cannot accept this. You can, said Brock Hendricks, and his voice carried the finality of a verdict delivered from a bench. And you will. That money comes with conditions. What conditions? A woman stepped forward from the Salt Lake City contingent, the first female rider Loretta had seen among the assembled group. She was in her 40s, lean and weathered and beautiful in the way that people shaped by hardship are beautiful, with eyes that held both steel and warmth in equal measure, and the bearing of someone who had earned every bit of ground she stood on. You keep this place running, the woman said. You keep the light on. You keep being exactly who you have always been. That is the only condition we have. Gunnar produced a rolled paper and spread it across the hood of Hank's truck. An architect's drawing professionally rendered showing the diner expanded to twice its current size. A lounge with pool tables and a jukebox. Covered motorcycle parking with shelters, maintenance bays for basic repairs, the spare room above the kitchen properly insulated and finished. Crossroads, Biker Haven Nunner said, tracing the lines of the drawing with his finger. Official rest stop for every Hells Angels chapter from California to Colorado. We guarantee regular business. We handle security. We coordinate maintenance. No one touches this place. No one threatens the woman who runs it. Ever. That is not a suggestion. It is a fact about the future. A grizzled veteran from the Phoenix chapter stepped forward. He had the face of a man who had seen everything and feared nothing, with scars that told stories his mouth would never tell. We are setting up a rotating protection detail. As of today, he announced. Teams from every chapter within range cycling on a monthly schedule. Nobody messes with this diner or with anyone in it. You are under Hells Angels protection now, Mrs. Weaver. I do not say that to impress you. I say it because it is simply true. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Brock Hendricks had been standing to the side, letting the ceremony of giving unfold. Now he stepped forward with a manila folder in his massive hands and an expression that had shifted from celebration to cold determination. There is one more thing, he said, and this is the part that Dennis Keller is not going to enjoy. The parking lot went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. One of our brothers, Brock, continued as a forensic accountant. He works for a firm in Oakland that specializes in financial fraud investigation. When Gunnar called me last night and described the situation with First Mountain Savings, I asked our brother to run the numbers. It took him 3 hours. He opened the folder and held up a sheet of paper covered in figures and highlighted columns and circled entries. In the last 18 months, First Mountain Savings has foreclosed on 14 commercial properties along the Highway 70 corridor. Every single one of those foreclosures was managed personally by Dennis Keller. Every single property was purchased by Summit Ridge Development within 60 days of foreclosure at prices significantly below their actual market value. And Summit Ridge Development, as it turns out, is a subsidiary of a holding company in which Dennis Keller himself holds a 12% ownership stake. The silence in the parking lot was absolute, not the silence of people waiting for more information. The silence of people who have just been given the final piece of a puzzle they had suspected but could not prove. That is not bad luck, Brock said, his voice measured and precise. That is not market conditions or economic downturn or any of the other explanations a man like Keller would offer if you asked him about the coincidence. That is a bank manager using his position and his institutional power to engineer foreclosures on properties he then profits from through a shell company. And it is a federal crime. Loretta stared at the folder. Everything she had suspected, every intuition she had pushed aside because she thought she was being paranoid. Every moment in Dennis Keller's office, when his pale eyes had drifted to the window, while he told her his hands were tied, all of it confirmed in 3 hours by a man in a leather jacket sitting in front of a laptop in Oakland. The documentation has already been forwarded to the FBI field office in Denver, Brock continued. Copies have gone to the state attorney general and the county prosecutor. I expect Mr. Keller will be receiving some visitors of his own in the very near future. The cheer that erupted from the assembled bikers was raw and thunderous, rolling up the mountain walls and echoing off the peaks and fading out into the vast blue sky like a salute. The sound of 87 men expressing their collective contempt for a man who had used his position to prey on people he had calculated would never be able to fight back. Inside the diner, Vance Dalton had already spread a county map across booth number 4 and was marking properties with a red pen. Look at this, he said when Loretta and Gunnar and Brock leaned over the table beside him. Every property Keller foreclosed on sits along the same 5-mile corridor. Gas stations, motels, the old campground 3 miles east. Your diner sits right in the center of the assembly. Brock pulled another document from his folder, a printout showing architectural renderings of a sprawling glass and steel resort complex that bore no resemblance to anything currently standing on Highway 70. Summit Ridge's master plan, Brock said. A resort and casino development. They needed continuous acreage along the highway frontage. Without your property, the corridor has a gap in the middle, and the whole project becomes unbuildable. Your diner is not just a target, it is the keystone. He was never going to let me keep this place, Loretta said quietly. No matter what I did, no matter how many payment plans I proposed, or extensions I requested, or buyers I found, he was always going to take it. Yes, Gunnar said. But he did not count on you being you. He did not count on 15 years of kindness coming back all at once. He thought he was dealing with a woman alone. He was not counting on 87 people who owe you debts they have never been able to repay. A commotion at the front of the diner interrupted them. Slade Riggs pushed through the door with an expression that was half amusement and half disbelief. "You are not going to believe this," he said. "There is a silver BMW in the parking lot, and the man driving it looks like he just swallowed something that disagreed with him violently." Loretta walked to the window and looked out. There, idling at the edge of the parking lot, surrounded on all sides by 87 motorcycles and the men who had ridden them through the aftermath of a blizzard, was a silver BMW sedan with a First Mountain Savings parking permit on its bumper. Inside, visible through the windshield, Dennis Keller sat with both hands on the steering wheel and his face the color of old ash. He had driven up the freshly plowed highway, expecting to find a desperate woman in an empty diner with her clock running out. He had found instead the largest gathering of Hell's Angels in the recorded history of the Colorado mountains, assembled in her parking lot at 8 in the morning, with their engines warming and their tensions clear. "Well," Gunner said, and there was a cold smile on his face that made Loretta understand for the first time exactly why people who knew him found him formidable. "Why do we not invite Mr. Keller in for some coffee?" Dennis Keller did not want coffee. Dennis Keller wanted to put his BMW in reverse and drive back down the mountain as fast as the road would allow. But his car was surrounded on three sides by motorcycles that had been parked with a precision that left him no room to maneuver. And when Gunner Blackwood walked across the packed snow of the parking lot and tapped on his driver's side window with one scarred knuckle, Dennis Keller understood that he did not have the option of declining. He emerged from the BMW in his camel hair overcoat and polished shoes entirely wrong for the packed snow in the cold mountain morning. Up close, he looked smaller than Loretta remembered, diminished somehow, as if the power he wielded from behind his desk did not travel well to open spaces where the rules he had mastered did not apply. "Mr. Keller," Gunner said pleasantly, "what brings you up to Highway 70 on such a beautiful morning?" Keller's pale eyes moved rapidly across the assembled bikers, cataloging patches and numbers, and the particular quality of attention being directed at him from every direction. His thin lips worked silently for a moment before he located his voice. "I was checking on a property of interest to the bank. I was not aware there was an event taking place." "An event," Gunner repeated, savoring the word. "I suppose you could call it that. We are celebrating this diner and the woman who runs it and the 15 years of kindness that built this place into something worth protecting." "I see. Well, that is very commendable. But the bank's position on the outstanding loan remains unchanged. Mrs. Weaver has 48 hours to produce the full amount owed, and I am afraid no amount of community support changes the legal reality of her financial situation." "Funny you should mention legal reality," Gunner said. He nodded at Brock, who stepped forward with the manila folder. Loretta watched Dennis Keller's face as Brock laid out the findings. She watched the information arrive, watched it register, watched the color drain from his already pale complexion until he looked like a man standing in a cold wind. The 14 foreclosures, the Summit Ridge connection, the Shell Company, the 12% ownership stake, the federal statutes governing abuse of fiduciary duty and wire fraud. "This is preposterous," Keller said. His voice had lost its professional smoothness and was now simply a voice thin and unsteady. "These allegations are completely without foundation. I will not stand here and be accused by criminals and outlaws who have no understanding of banking law or corporate structure, or—" "By whom?" Mr. Keller, Brock said softly. "By the kind of people you have been stealing from for 3 years, by the men whose friends and family members you decided would never have the resources or the connections to fight back." He held up the folder. "This documentation is already in the hands of the FBI. The state attorney general has a copy. So does the county prosecutor. Your days of engineering foreclosures for personal profit are over. Every one of those 14 foreclosures will be reviewed, including the one you came up here this morning to finalize. Starting today, you have no more authority over this property than I do." Keller's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. He looked at Loretta, and for the first time she saw him without the armor of his office and his desk and his institutional power. He was just a man, a small, frightened man who had built a profitable world on a simple calculation that the people he targeted would never be able to reach him. The calculation had been wrong. "Your hands are tied, Mr. Keller," Loretta said. Her voice was steady and quiet, and the words tasted exactly like what they were. Justice served cold on a December morning. My deepest sympathies. Keller turned without another word and walked back to his BMW with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man whose body is operating on autopilot because his mind has already gone somewhere else. He climbed in, started the engine, sat for a long moment staring through the windshield at the sea of motorcycles surrounding him. Then he put the car in gear and pulled out slowly, carefully, threading through the narrow gap that the bikers had opened for him, and drove down the highway toward town without looking back. The parking lot erupted. Bikers cheered and whistled and pounded each other's shoulders with the particular joy of men who had just watched a bully learn publicly and irrevocably the limits of his power. Loretta stood in the middle of it all, her arms wrapped around Destiny, and she laughed until her ribs ached and her eyes streamed, and the sound of her joy mixed with the roar of 87 men and echoed off the mountains that Calvin had loved with everything he had. Gunnar was not finished. He reached into his jacket and produced a final envelope, small and worn at the edges as if it had been carried for a long time in a pocket close to the body. He held it out to Loretta. "This is from Hank," he said. "He asked me to give it to you before any of the rest of this started." Loretta opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a business card creased and faded, the Crossroads Diner logo and phone number printed in Calvin's careful handwriting. She recognized the card. It was one of the batch they had printed in the first year on slightly too thick stock because neither of them had known much about printing at the time. Behind the card was a handwritten note on paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had turned white and soft. 13 years I carried this card. It went with me on every haul, every highway, every mile between here and everywhere else in this country. I kept it because it reminded me that there are people in this world who will save your life and refuse to let you thank them. You gave me a second chance, Loretta. Everything good in my life from that night forward traces back to you and to the man who built this place with you. This card belongs in your diner on your wall, where it can remind you of what Calvin always knew. This place is more than a restaurant. It is a beacon, and beacons do not go out. Loretta pressed the note against her chest and closed her eyes. She could feel Calvin so close, it was almost painful. His presence woven into the walls and the floor and the counter, and the booths and the hearts of every person standing in the parking lot of the diner he had built from love and savings, and an unshakable belief that kindness was never wasted. He was not gone. He had never truly been gone. He had dispersed himself across the lives of every person he had helped, scattered his warmth and his generosity across 1,000 interactions, on 1,000 roads, and now those lives had gathered here to carry forward what he had started, to be the ripple returning to its source. When she opened her eyes, Destiny was standing directly in front of her. "I have been thinking," Destiny said, "about what I told you in the kitchen, about wanting to fight for women like me. And I know what I want to do. I want to study law. I want to become the person that the system refused to be for me. I want to make sure that the next woman who walks into a police station with bruises on her arms and a story that nobody wants to hear does not get told that there is insufficient evidence to act. I want to rewrite the rules that left me unprotected. I want to be the person on the other side of the desk who says, 'I believe you tell me everything.'" Loretta smiled, and the smile felt like something long shut, finally opening all the way. "Then you rewrite the rules, baby. And every time you walk into that courtroom or sit across from someone who needs to be believed, you remember that a woman who serves soup in a mountain diner always believed you could change the world." Gunnar stepped forward with something in his hands, a bronze plaque, small and elegant, its surface engraved with professional care. He held it out to Loretta and waited while she read the words through tears that made the letters swim. "For Calvin Weaver, the man on the road who stopped when no one else would, the trucker who saved a stranger in a Montana ditch and never told his name. Your kindness lives on in every life you touched, and your light still shines through the woman you loved and the diner you built. From the brothers you never knew you had. Thunder Ridge, MC." "We would like to mount this by the front door," Gunnar said, "if you will allow it." Loretta pressed the plaque against her heart, the cold metal warming against her skin and her heartbeat, and she nodded because she could not find words large enough for what she was feeling. She let the tears speak for her instead, and they said everything that needed to be said. The woman from the Salt Lake City chapter, whose name was Maggie Steele, had found Destiny in the kitchen during the celebration and was sitting across from her with the quiet authority of someone who recognized a kindred spirit and knew exactly what that recognition was worth. "I was 20 when I got out of my situation," Maggie was saying, when Loretta drifted close enough to hear. "Younger than you, and there was no one like Loretta on the other end. I had a shelter and a social worker who meant well, but did not have the experience to understand what I had been through. It took me 10 years to stop sleeping with my back to the wall." "Does it ever actually stop?" Destiny asked. "The fear, the part of you that is always waiting for him to walk through a door." "It changes shape," Maggie said, the voice of a woman who was speaking from 10 years beyond where Destiny stood. "It stops being the thing that controls you and starts being the thing that makes you strong. Because you walked through fire and came out the other side, and you are still here. That means you are tougher than anything that comes next." The fear becomes a reminder of your own survival rather than an anticipation of more harm. Destiny was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be the person who was not there for me," she said. "For the next woman, I want to be the legal advocate who looks at the bruises in the story and says, 'I believe you,' without waiting for the system to give her permission to act." Maggie looked at her steadily. "Then that is exactly what you are going to become." In the dining room, the renovation planning had entered a second phase. Brock Hendricks had a laptop open on a counter and was sketching modifications to the architect's plans based on input from the assembled chapter presidents, each of whom had opinions about what a proper biker haven should include based on years of knowing exactly what they needed and did not have on the road. Workshop space with proper ventilation, shower facilities for long-haul riders, proper rest areas separate from the dining room, a kitchen large enough to feed a large group on short notice, a covered area for bike maintenance in bad weather. The conversation had the focused energy of men planning something they fully intended to build, not someday, but as soon as the ground thawed enough for foundation work. Loretta moved through all of it, pouring coffee and accepting thanks and listening to more stories she had forgotten, and that turned out to matter deeply to the people who had lived them. And at one point, she found herself standing alone in the kitchen doorway, looking out at the packed dining room at the 23 Thunder Ridge men and the growing crowd of visiting chapter members, and Hank Gallagher holding court at the counter, and Destiny talking to Maggie Steele with something new in her eyes. And the wave of emotion that hit her buckled her knees. She pressed her hands to the doorframe to steady herself. When she looked down, she saw that her fingers were resting on a groove in the wood where Calvin had carved their initials the day they signed the purchase agreement, before the renovations had begun, before the first cup of coffee had been brewed, when this had still been just a building with potential and a dream. L&C, two letters separated by a small plus sign worn smooth now, by 15 years of hands passing over them without knowing they were there. She pressed her fingertip into the groove and held it there, and felt everything she needed to feel and did not try to stop any of it or speed it along. The CB radio crackled to life around noon. It had been silent for 2 years. Its bent antenna had become a monument to something Loretta could not quite bring herself to dismantle, the last piece of infrastructure. From the time when this stretch of highway had been alive with trucker traffic, and Calvin had sat at this counter at all hours monitoring the channels and calling out road conditions and checking in on the drivers he had come to know over 15 years of the same highways. The voice that came through was rough and familiar with the cadence of a man who spent his life behind a wheel. "Breaker 19, this is Roadhound calling for the Angel. Heard through the grapevine there was some trouble out there. Salt Lake chapter rolling with additional supplies about 20 minutes out. We are not letting anything happen to our guardian angel. Over." Loretta crossed the dining room in 5 steps. She picked up the microphone with hands that trembled. She pressed the transmit button and held it down, and when she spoke, her voice went out over the frequency that Calvin had kept alive like a heartbeat. The frequency where truckers had heard his voice for 15 years, calling out road conditions and checking in and making the long miles feel a little less lonely. "Roadhound," she said, "this is Crossroads. The angel is here. The light is on. Come on in." The cheer that erupted from the bikers rattled the windows in their frames. Outside, motorcycle engines revved in response, a spontaneous thunder that rolled up the mountain walls and echoed off the peaks and faded into the vast blue sky above the Colorado Rockies, like a salute fired in the direction of something worth saluting. Gunnar found Loretta late in the afternoon standing on the back steps of the diner looking at the mountains. The sun was setting behind the western peaks and painting the sky in colors that seemed too extravagant to be real gold and crimson, and deep violet that bled into each other at the edges. The snow on the mountains caught the light and held it and threw it back in fragments that looked to Loretta like the world was on fire in the most beautiful possible way. "You know what the best part of all this is?" Gunnar said, leaning on the railing beside her, with the ease of a man who was comfortable anywhere he chose to stand. "Tell me, 2 nights ago you did not see Hell's Angels. You did not see outlaws or dangerous men or people to be afraid of. You saw 23 men who needed help, and you opened your door. That is what started all of this. Not the money, not the chapters, not the protection detail or the plaque or the legal action against Keller. Just a woman who opened a door because that was who she was." "Calvin used to say that you never know which door is the one that changes everything," Loretta said. "He said you just have to keep opening them all every time, even when you are tired and even when you are scared, because the one you are about to close might be the one that matters." Gunnar was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. He was right. He straightened and pulled on his gloves. "Thunder Ridge rides out in the morning, but we will be back every month, maybe more often. And there will always be someone here, someone from one of the chapters within range. You will never be alone in this diner again, Loretta." "I was never alone," she said. "Calvin was always here. I just forgot how to feel him." Gunnar mounted his Harley, and the engine caught with a roar that echoed off every surface and filled the evening air with its particular music. Behind him, the Thunder Ridge chapter was forming up. In the parking lot, 23 bikes in tight formation, their chrome catching the last of the sunset and throwing it back at the sky in fragments of gold. "Keep the light on," Loretta, Gunnar called over the rumble. "Always," she called back, "always." She stood on the porch and watched them ride out. Watched the formation tighten as it reached the highway, the bikes finding their spacing with the ease of long practice. Watched the tail lights diminish around the curve of the mountain and disappear. Listened to the engine sound fade until it was indistinguishable from the wind. Then she stood in the silence that followed and listened to the world settle back into its familiar rhythms. The wind in the pines above the diner. The creak of the neon sign cooling in the evening air. The distant sound of the highway coming back to life after the storm. The first trucks rolling through the first ordinary travelers, resuming the interrupted business of their lives. 6 months later, Crossroads Biker Haven was recognized by every chapter west of the Mississippi as the most important dedicated rest stop in the mountain region. The expanded parking lot could accommodate over 100 bikes under covered shelters that kept the chrome dry and the engines warm in winter. The maintenance bays were in constant use, staffed on rotation by volunteers from the nearest chapters who happened to have the relevant skills. The lounge with the pool tables and the jukebox was rarely empty on weekend evenings. The bronze plaque for Calvin hung beside the front door, mounted at eye level, where it could not be missed. And every biker who entered touched it as they came, in a gesture that had begun spontaneously on the first day it was mounted and had become by the end of the first week simply what you did when you arrived at Crossroads. A gesture of respect for the man who had started it all by pulling over on a dark Montana highway 20 years ago and choosing to help a stranger who had nothing to offer him in return. Dennis Keller was indicted on 14 counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The FBI investigation that began with the folder Brock Hendricks had prepared in 3 hours expanded over the following months to one of the most comprehensive financial fraud cases in the county's history, revealing a network of corrupt transactions spanning 3 years and involving not just the Highway 70 properties, but commercial real estate acquisitions across 3 counties. Summit Ridge Development was dissolved by court order. Its assets seized, its principals charged alongside Keller. The properties it had acquired through Keller's schemes were returned to their original owners where possible, or sold at genuine market value through a court-appointed administrator. Dennis Keller's manicured hands looked considerably less comfortable when they were photographed in handcuffs on the steps of the federal courthouse. The photographs appeared on the front page of the local paper and were cut out and pinned to the corkboard at Crossroads below Calvin's photographs, where they remained until the paper yellowed and curled at the edges. Destiny Cross enrolled in pre-law at the University of Colorado in the spring. Her tuition and living expenses were covered by a scholarship fund established by the combined Hells Angels Western chapters, a fund created for exactly one purpose: to educate a young woman who had decided to change the system that had failed her. The scholarship was named for no one and advertised nowhere. It simply existed, quietly funded annually by the chapters that had stood in a parking lot on a December morning and watched a 22-year-old woman choose a different kind of fight than the one that had been forced on her. Destiny kept a photograph of Loretta on her desk in her dormitory room, next to a copy of Hank Gallagher's note in a small piece of formica that Loretta had chipped off the edge of the counter and given her the day she left for school. Every time she opened a textbook that seemed impenetrable or sat across from a professor who seemed unconvinced that she belonged in the room, she looked at the photograph and remembered a diner on a mountain highway where a woman with $47 had fed 23 strangers, because that was what you did when people needed help, and where that same woman had once looked at a frightened girl in a doorway and seen someone worth saving. Wade Boone was arrested 6 weeks after the blizzard on an outstanding warrant in Grand Junction related to an incident predating his prison term. He did not contact Destiny again. Whatever Vance Dalton had whispered to him in the doorway of the diner that December night remained between the two of them, but its effect was permanent and complete. Wade Boone's new understanding of his situation appeared to be thorough and lasting. And Loretta? Loretta Weaver stood behind the counter of Crossroads Biker Haven every single day and served coffee to bikers and truckers and travelers and families on their way through the mountains and anyone else who walked through the door. She served them with the same grace and attention and genuine care that she and Calvin had brought to this place 15 years ago, when it was nothing but a dream and a building and a belief that kindness mattered even when it was expensive and even when no one was watching and even when you could not see where it was going to land. She hung Hank Gallagher's note next to the corkboard of photographs, framed it properly with a simple wooden frame from the hardware store in town, and every new customer who sat long enough at the counter to notice it would eventually ask about it, and Loretta would tell them the story, the trucker and the heart attack and the 30 miles through a rock slide, and the man who would not give his name, and by the end the customers always understood that the story was not really about the note. The story was about what the note pointed to. The CB radio crackled constantly now, day and night. Bikers calling in from highways across the western United States checking conditions, letting the Angel know they were on their way, asking about road conditions east of the pass, asking whether there was room for 6 bikes in the maintenance bay, asking the question that had become the informal greeting between Crossroads and the road. "How is our Angel doing tonight?" And Loretta always answered the same way. The way Calvin would have answered, the way she had been answering since the December night when she had picked up that microphone with trembling hands and spoken into the frequency that connected her to the world beyond the mountains. The light is on, the coffee is hot, and the road is always open for family. Because that was what a Crossroads had become, and what it had always been even before it had the name for what it was. Not just a diner, not just a biker haven or a rest stop or a landmark on a mountain highway. Proof that the smallest acts of generosity could travel the farthest distances. That a cup of coffee given freely to a stranger could save a life you would never know you saved. That a door opened without calculation in a blizzard could bring the whole world to your doorstep on a December morning. That the light you put into the world always, always, always finds its way back. Calvin had known that. He had known it from the beginning, before they had bought the building, before they had signed the papers, before the first cup of coffee had been brewed, and the first stranger had walked in out of the cold and found something they had not known they were looking for. He had known it on a back road in Montana 20 years ago, when he had climbed down from his cab and found a man in a ditch and had not hesitated, not for 1 second, not because it was convenient or safe, or because he expected anything in return, but because it was simply what you did when someone needed help and you were the person who happened to be there. He had known it every morning when he rose before dawn to make the coffee, and every evening when he turned off the lights, and every ordinary day in between, when the work of feeding people and listening to people and treating people with dignity was nothing more dramatic than what it was, a choice made again and again to show up and be decent and keep the door open. And now the whole highway knew it. The chapters knew it. The truckers on the CB knew it. The families who stopped for lunch and the solo riders who stopped for coffee and the travelers who arrived in the middle of storms and found the lights still on, all of them knew it. The light would always guide them home. Calvin had made sure of that. And Loretta, standing behind the counter of the diner her husband had built from love and savings and an unshakable belief in the essential decency of strangers, kept his promise every day. Keep the light on, baby. She did. She always did. She always would. End of story. The months that followed the blizzard remade Crossroads in ways that Loretta had not anticipated and could not have planned for. Change came not in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulated weight of small, consistent presences, the way all lasting things are built. The first renovation crew arrived 3 weeks after the storm. 6 men from the Denver chapter, who happened to include among their number a licensed contractor, 2 experienced carpenters, a plumber who had spent 20 years doing commercial work before the road claimed him full-time, and 2 others who were simply willing and strong and did not need to be told twice what was needed. They worked for 4 days straight, sleeping on cots in the expanded dining room and eating whatever Loretta could produce, which was considerably more than $47 worth of supplies now that the crisis had passed and the donated funds had been deposited in a new account at a bank whose manager did not have a pending indictment. They repaired the heating system properly for the first time since October. They replaced the 2 dead radiators and re-ran the corroded main line with new copper pipe. And on the morning the new system came online, the diner filled with a warmth so consistent and reliable that Loretta stood in the middle of the dining room and breathed it in and felt something in her chest that had been braced against the cold for 2 years finally carefully relax. They patched the roof where the decades had opened small gaps that grew worse every winter. They fixed the front steps that had been listing to one side since the spring thaw 2 years back. They rehung the kitchen door so that it swung true and sealed properly against drafts. They replaced the bathroom fixtures, the buzzing fluorescent tubes throughout, and the ancient register that had been held together with a rubber band in Loretta's patience since November. None of them would take payment for the labor. The contractor, a quiet man named Tanner, who had a silver beard and hands as careful as a surgeon's, said simply that it was work that needed doing, and he was glad to do it. Loretta fed them every meal and kept the coffee coming, and on the last evening she made a dinner that she later heard described in 3 separate states as the best meal a man had eaten in years, which she suspected was more about gratitude than cooking, but she accepted the compliment anyway. The covered parking structures went up in February, designed by a woman from the Salt Lake City chapter who turned out to have an architecture degree from a university she had attended before the road became her life. The structures were practical and clean built to withstand the mountain winters, with outlets for battery tenders and a drainage system that kept standing water from accumulating under the bikes. They went up in 10 days, the crew rotating as riders came through heading east or west and stopped to put in a day of work before continuing. By spring, the maintenance bays were operational, staffed on an informal rotation that somehow produced consistent coverage without anyone having to maintain a schedule in writing. Word spread through the chapters, the way word about road conditions spread through CB chatter and text messages, and the particular telephone of men who spent their lives in motion and had developed communication networks that operated entirely outside conventional systems. A biker with transmission trouble 200 miles out could call ahead and know that someone at Crossroads would have the time and the parts and the knowledge to help. The highway came back to life as the season turned. The detour that had bled Loretta's customer base for 6 months was finally resolved when the construction project it had served was completed and the traffic that had bypassed Crossroads began to return. But it was not the same traffic it had been. The diner's reputation had shifted in the community in ways that Loretta did not fully understand until a woman from the town 15 miles east told her over coffee one morning that everybody knew about the Christmas miracle, which was what people in the valley had started calling the night of the blizzard. The woman said this casually, as if the story were common knowledge, and Loretta realized that it was. The 87 motorcycles on Highway 70, the confrontation in the parking lot, Dennis Keller's indictment, the bronze plaque by the door, all of it had passed through the valley's networks of conversation and had settled into the particular status of local legend that small communities bestow on things that confirm what they want to believe about the world. That decency is rewarded, that kindness compounds over time, that the people you write off as dangerous sometimes turn out to be the only ones willing to stand between you and genuine harm. Travelers stopped now who had not stopped before, families who had heard the story, truckers who had known Calvin years ago and wanted to see what had become of the place he had built. A journalist from a Denver paper came twice, once in the spring and once in the summer, and wrote a piece that ran on a Sunday and was shared enough times online to send a wave of new customers up Highway 70 for 3 weeks. Loretta gave the journalist coffee and answered her questions honestly, and asked only that she not make the bikers seem like props in someone else's story, that she acknowledge them as the main agents of what had happened, the ones who had made the choice to show up and the ones whose help had actually meant something. The journalist honored the request. The scholarship that funded Destiny's education was quietly expanded in its second year to include two additional recipients, both young women from situations similar to Destiny's, who had been identified through domestic violence advocacy organizations in Colorado and Wyoming. The scholarship had no public name and accepted no applications. Its recipients were selected by a committee of three that included Maggie Steele and changed membership annually and operated on the simple principle that the women who needed it most were rarely the ones who knew how to ask for it. Destiny called on Sundays without fail from her dormitory room or from the library or sometimes from the road when she was traveling somewhere for a clinical program that placed law students with domestic violence advocacy organizations across the state. The calls were long and winding, full of case studies and legal theories, and the particular frustration of someone who had chosen a field precisely because it was broken and was discovering daily how thoroughly it was broken and how much work the repair would require. Loretta listened to all of it and said what she thought and did not soften her opinions when they differed from Destiny's, and generally tried to be what Calvin had been to her, which was someone who took you seriously enough to disagree with you when you were wrong. Finn Slater passed through Crossroads 4 times in the first year after the blizzard. Each time he stayed for a day or two and worked whatever needed working and ate whatever was on the grill and sat in the evenings at the counter with coffee talking with Loretta in the easy way of people who have been through something together and do not need to establish their connection every time they meet. He was different each time, a little steadier, a little more at home in himself, a little further from the boy who had stopped his motorcycle on a mountain highway 3 years ago because he had run out of reasons to keep going. He never talked directly about that night. Neither did Loretta. They talked about other things, about the road and the weather and the bikes and what he was learning and where he was thinking of going next. But sometimes in a pause in the conversation, Loretta would catch him looking at the corkboard of photographs, in the note in its wooden frame, and the bronze plaque visible through the window beside the front door, and his face would have that look that she recognized from the testimonials in the dining room, the look of someone who is thinking about a moment that changed the direction of everything and is quietly, privately grateful for it. Gunnar Blackwood came back in March, riding alone this time on a gray morning, with the mountains still white above the tree line and the highway shining wet from overnight rain. He sat at the counter and drank 2 cups of coffee and did not say much about anything in particular. When he was ready to leave, he placed on the counter beside his empty mug a folded piece of paper. Loretta opened it after he had gone. It was a photograph, old and faded, printed on the kind of paper that cameras produced before everything went digital. A hospital room. A large man in a bed with his head turned toward the camera and both eyes swollen mostly shut, but something in the expression of his damaged face that was unmistakably a smile. And beside the bed, barely in the frame, the arm and shoulder and partial profile of a man in a flannel shirt and a Western mountain transport cap. Loretta turned the photograph over. On the back in Gunnar's handwriting, 4 words. He was right there. She pinned the photograph to the corkboard beside the others below, and to the left of the picture of Calvin, behind the counter with his arm around her, and she stood for a moment looking at the 2 images, side by side, the man she had loved and the stranger who had been shaped by his kindness and carried that shaping for 20 years until it brought him back to her. She touched the corkboard lightly with her fingertips. "I know," she said quietly to the empty dining room, to the photographs and the note, and the buzzing neon sign and the plaque catching the morning light by the door. "I know you were always right here." The clock above the register read 8:15. Same as it had read on the night of the blizzard, the same patient face marking the same hour, in a different world than the one that had preceded it. Loretta went to the coffee machine and started the morning brew, the familiar sounds filling the diner, the gurgle and the hiss and the particular smell that had defined the start of every working day for 15 years. She turned on the counter lamps. She unlocked the front door. She kept the light on.